Rich, welcome. It's great to talk to you again. One of the things that you're tracking, especially regarding data, is the enterprise cloud efforts that that agencies are undertaking. What's your sense of where agencies are on that journey versus where you would like to see them go?
Well, it's a great question. The agencies are a lot more comfortable. We're about 10 years into the cloud journey for many agencies, and agencies are a lot more comfortable. They have a lot of their policies and their strategies in place on how they want to start moving forward with, many agencies are fairly far down the road with their cloud strategy. Others are kind of like at a midpoint in the journey, but we've definitely passed a tipping point where we're seeing, there's no turning back. You're going to see pretty much everyone's going to be in some form of a cloud. There'll be some on-prem sites left that'll be for various reasons. You'll probably have hybrid cloud operations, but we're moving, I would say, to the next phase where you're starting to see multi-cloud tenancy, and agencies are being more comfortable with deciding what's the right solution for the right mission. And we're starting to have a more sophisticated buy around the different cloud strategies, which is really, frankly, exciting.
What are the decision-making factors that agencies should consider when they're looking at multi-cloud environments?
Well, I think the first one is, what's the mission? What problem are you trying to solve, right? That's always a key thing. That will lead you on a journey on what you're going to need in terms of security, resilience, latency, accessibility. And then, you start looking at then if you need an edge solution coupled with a true cloud solution. So I think there's a lot of different things, but it always starts with the mission. If you don't have the mission central to what your strategy is, you might wind up going down a strategy that's going to be very difficult to then back into the mission at a later date.
Mm-hmm. You use the term edge solution, and it's striking to me that 5 years ago, halfway into the cloud journey, that discussion seemed to be limited exclusively to the Defense Department. And I think we'll hear today, every agency is thinking about cloud deployment from an edge perspective, at least partially. Is that a fair read on my part?
Yeah, I think it is. I think what we're finding is, as we have more ubiquitous use of mobile solutions, that you need to have compute power where you need it, where the mission is being accomplished. So whether it's at the border, whether it's at a loading dock, or at a port or a harbor, or at a processing facility around the country, you need to have the compute power where you need it in a timely manner, and then have that integrated into your broader cloud strategy.
A term that you've used in the past when we have talked about cloud is scaled delivery. What's that term mean, and how does that fit into the way agencies should think about a multi-cloud environment?
Again, I think that's a great question. Again, when you think about scale delivery, the way at least I think about it is, you have some workloads that are fairly constant, well-defined. You have others that are burst loads. And so being able to ramp up and ramp down so that you can not only support the mission where you need it, but also do it in a cost-effective manner so that you're not having too much capacity when you don't necessarily need it for those quiet times, but also have the ability to scale up to provide resiliency to the mission and the level of service, whether it's a citizen-facing application or an application that's supporting the business of government. I think those are really important factors in looking at scaling and scale to size.
Another element that I think we'll hear about today, referring to something that you mentioned earlier, is the fact that what makes the cloud ubiquitous for a lot of agencies is what they're doing in the cloud. A lot of these are mission-focused, can't fail applications and operations that they're undertaking in the cloud.
Sure. Well, again, if you start all your problem solving with the mission, what is it you're trying to achieve? You start to understand what are your risk tolerances for failure. And what you'll find in most government solutions, if not all, there's a very low risk tolerance, whether it's a citizen-facing application or it's a business of government application. You need to have resilience that, quite frankly, the private sector doesn't always necessarily need to have. And so I think when you're looking at that mission criticality is got to be paramount in your solution set when you're picking your cloud partner.
The resilience that the private sector doesn't need could potentially be roadblock, obstacle, maybe those aren't the right terms, but difficult for an agency to discern because the private sector doesn't necessarily need it. How does an agency determine that a particular solution is going to be 99 and 5, 6, 7, 8, 9s, whatever, reliable and resilient for them?
Well, I think when you think about the nature of the work, so if it's public safety, a good example is law enforcement. There's really no private analog for law enforcement, right? So if you're a law enforcement official and you need timely access to data, timely access to networks to enforce the law, to protect citizens, that is a no-fail mission. That cannot go down. So I think that's a good example where you need that resilience and that redundancy that the private sector doesn't necessarily need to achieve. If you're thinking about systems that are like air traffic control, things that, again, can't afford to go down, again, there's very little private sector analogs to that. And so I think there's definitely lessons learned from the private sector, but I think, frankly, the private sector can learn a lot from the government sector because they have to manage to a much higher standard.
Mm-hmm. What are those lessons that you think the private sector could learn?
Well, I think the importance of redundancy, right? I think the importance of provenance of data. I think when you start to realize that, when you're dealing with citizens' data and you're dealing with sensitive data, it's really important to understand the provenance of the data, who's touched it, what was the reason for touching it, the integrity of the data. Again, when you're dealing in private sector, your concerns are quite often lawsuits. When you're dealing with public data, you're dealing with safety. You're dealing with life safety. You're dealing with national security. These are issues that are beyond just legal matters, and so therefore you have to be very careful with it. So I think what we'll see more and more of is as these data-enabled missions continue to move forward, while you'll have cloud solutions and you'll certainly have enterprise software solutions, I think you'll also it's going to boil down to is treating them as data solutions where there's a provenance of data.
Regarding data, I had a conversation with a federal CIO recently, and I said, what sectors in the private sector do you look to potentially learn lessons or best practices or whatever? The first one that this person told me about was financial services, and that makes a lot of sense. The second one was hospitality. And the reason that this person cited that was because of the customer experience factor. What does that data intersection with the cloud architecture look like? And how are you seeing agencies thinking about data as either an important component or the most important component of the way that they're building their architecturing their infrastructures?
Well, I think what we're finding as a consequence of a lot of the modernization we're seeing, whether it's cloud or enterprise software, is as you move from siloed solutions, where you might have a data lake or data set that was for a specific enterprise solution, and now that you're getting more federated data and people are finding that you can use different sets of data creatively to solve problems that you couldn't use in the past, getting to an open architecture that's scalable, that's resilient, is really going to be the basis of what I would think is going to be the next generation of solutions.
Mm-hmm. The open architecture means what in the way that organizations are putting the pieces of their networks together?
That, basically that the mission holders will be able to identify the data that they need, access the data that they need in an appropriate way with the right levels of authority to access, read, write, subscribe, publish to it, but it allow different mission holders to, essentially reach out beyond necessarily their silo and actually pull in data that they need to execute their mission in different ways. I think we've seen a lot of that in recent years. Certainly the DoD and Intel community is farther ahead than the civilian agencies, but I think the civilian agencies now are at a tipping point where there's going to be much more data sharing than what we've seen in the past.
And that open architecture, it strikes me, is important as technology advances at such a rapid pace, even more so than it did just a couple of years ago. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all of the other buzzwords that we're talking about, I imagine, are drivers of the open architecture movement so that people can plug in whatever they need to plug in, maybe even things we don't know exist today.
Sure. And I think, this is where the private sector helps, because as a lot of the vendors, many of the vendor communities, not all of them, are norming around certain standards for data and interoperability. I think it's going to make it easier for agencies to kind of subscribe into the different tech stacks that they need for their mission. At the same time, take advantage of some of the industry-wide standards that you're going to need, which is really foundational for the next leg of the journey, as you'll start to see more and more AI and being deployed by agencies to solve problems in a timely manner.
Rich, it's great to talk to you. Thank you very much for having us here, and thank you for the conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.